Okay, everybody, I think we'll get started here. Again, my name is Ruth. You heard from me this morning. I talked a little bit about the Global Alliance. What I wanted to do, just to provide a really brief introduction, just given that we're behind time a bit, although we'll be able to go over time a little bit at the back end, is I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about my background. I'm based in Toronto. Previous to the Global Alliance, I was at the Metcalfe Foundation, which is a foundation based in Toronto that established the first program of its kind on sustainable food and agriculture in Canada. I ran that program for about 10 years with Metcalfe, and we really funded a lot of the very, very early initiatives in the country around sustainable food and agriculture. Everything from alternative labeling systems to farmland protection, to the cultural dimensions of farming, which is a really fascinating thing happening in Toronto right now. I think Toronto is deemed one of the most, if not the most, multicultural cities in the, on the planet, in the globe. And so we have a lot of new Canadians. And so we've had a lot of really interesting initiatives trying to get traditional implements into the country, seeds, to develop farming systems that really meet people's preferences from where they come from. And I've done a lot of work with Aboriginal communities as well in Canada. The other thing I want to say is I'm not a content expert on social and cultural externalities or health or any of the issues we're talking about here. I'm a really good generalist. But I can just say from a personal perspective that I'm from a farming family, and I'm 46 years old, and in my very short lifetime, I have seen massive changes on the family farm. I used to hang out as a young child with my grandmother, gathering eggs and feeding the pigs and roaming through the chicken barns. And now we have large barns with massive biohazard signs on the doors. And so I just, feel these issues very viscerally, and particularly from a social and cultural standpoint, have really seen big shifts just in my own backyard. So I just wanted to mention that. I mentioned this morning that we do have a working group with the Global Alliance focused on advancing well-being, and that working group is just getting going. But what I would like to say is that even in the early days, we've had some really interesting conversations about what this means. What does well-being mean? The session this morning that was really focused on health talked a lot about sort of biomedical perspectives, really looking at nutrition. But beyond that, I think we can kind of take that, and sort of nugget what health means and really start to expand it, open it out, and to talk more about well-being in terms of equity, security, access, culture, sovereignty. Some of the conversations we've had with the working group include the community's ability to produce their own food. Food is a social and cultural act. I mentioned a few words this morning: self-worth, ceremony, self-determination, family. All these things, I think, come into a much broader definition about social, cultural, and health impacts in terms of the food system. I had some other comments, but I think given time, I'm going to keep them really, really short. I did just want to pull out a quote from one of our meetings that we had recently from a working group member with the Advancing Wellbeing Working Group. He said, "We come at so many issues from a fragmented, siloed worldview. We leave intangibles at the margins or out of the picture completely. Things get dropped and move into the shadows. We recognize that well-being is going to come from reestablishing our connection to these lost pieces." And I think that's part of our challenge today, is to really find some of those lost pieces and to make them more visible to policymakers, to institutions, all in an effort to advance the tools and the pressure to make different decisions. So I hope that we can start to get at that a little bit today. We are quite a bit behind, but I've been told that we can go until 1, so we'll extend the session into lunch a little bit. And I don't know who was here at the earlier health session, but I think we'll sort of follow the same format where we'll have 4 speakers. I'll introduce each one of them just before they speak, and then we can have a time for questions and discussion after that. So the same questions sort of exist for this session as existed for the other sessions. Set out extent of knowledge gaps in this category, identify additional research needed, identify policy mechanisms, barriers to change and opportunities, and then some specific recommendations. And I think there's a real interest in getting to those recommendations that we can bring back and start to figure out what this picture looks like in terms of what we might want to do collectively together into the future. So again, we've got 4 speakers, Philip, Jeanette, Matt, and Daniel. That's the order they'll be speaking in. And to start with, I'll just say a few words about Philip, who will be our first speaker. And I haven't yet met Philip, so I see you nodding at me. Nice to meet you. Philip is the CEO of Compassion in World Farming, which is a leading international farm welfare organization. He was Compassion's campaigns director through the 90s, and that was a period of extraordinary success, including an EU-wide ban on veal crates and battery cages. He's a prominent commentator on the effects of industrial farming. In fact, he received several awards for being a highly effective campaigner and educator. His roles include communications director at the World Society for the Protection of Animals, and he's been a freelance strategist for various environmental groups. He's published various things on ethical performance of supermarkets, food labeling, and fish farming, and essentially communicates and campaigns on how industrial agriculture affects people, animals, and the planet. He has a blog you could ask him about, and he'll be talking to us about health and social consequences of industrial livestock farming. So please welcome Philip.
So, good morning to you all, and thanks so much for having me here. When we speak to the industrial agricultural lobby, you could be forgiven for thinking that industrial agriculture is like a magician's hat, that lots comes out for very little going in, and that's why we pay so little. I just want to start with a moment 18 months ago when I was in a boat off the coast of Peru. I'd just been out to see Asia Island, which is one of the former guano islands, which used to be used as, the guano used to be shipped from Peru to Queen Victoria's agricultural fields for organic fertilizer 150 years ago, or of that order. And when I got to the guano island, I heard tales of how if you stepped on that island, the sky would turn black. Such was the weight of birds. And when I got there and saw it myself, there was barely a bird there. The birds barely formed a tidal ring around the rim of the island. And that decline started about 60 years ago, when which correlates with the start of the industrial fishing of anchovies off of Peru. And on my way back, I saw this scene on this slide, and I saw a cetacean breaking the surface, and in the background, an industrial chicken farm. And I reflected that beyond that were communities where the infants were, a significant proportion were likely to be malnourished. And beyond that, I envisaged the growing human population and the need to produce food. And I thought about how those things are apparently disconnected, but actually are not. And I wanted to start today very quickly, just trying to give an idea of how, when you talk to the industrial agricultural lobby, and remember that the anchovies in Peru it's the world's largest single species fishery. It supplies 1/3 of the world's fish meal. Much of that is coming into Europe, including the UK, and into China to feed industrially reared agriculture. 80% of the fishery in Peru is destined for fish meal, the anchovy fishery. The interesting thing is that when you look at what the revenue is, 1/3 of the revenue from the anchovy fishery, from the fishery in Peru, comes from the fish meal sector. The very small part of the fishery which goes for human consumption actually yields twice the revenue. So that sparked off the idea that we can begin to see the opportunity cost of feeding the developed world's desire for industrial agriculture. So that set me on a theme, and I began to think about, as an animal protection organization, how to put animal welfare into a bigger picture, into a bigger frame of dependencies and characteristics. And Factory farming, industrial agriculture, I can see has got 4 basic dependencies and characteristics. The first dependency is that it's dependent on feed from the land and from the ocean. A characteristic is that it's hugely wasteful. We'll come on to that in a minute. A dependency is the routine use of antibiotics to ward off disease, particularly in the poultry and pig meat sectors, from fundamentally unhealthy systems. The problem being too many animals in too small a space. And another characteristic is high consumption of saturated animal fats. So I then began to think about how we can put some numbers against these. And first thing to think about is that it's not just fish meal that goes into industrial animal feed, it's cereals and soya. And if you put all of the cereals and soya being grown worldwide for industrial livestock into a single field, that field would cover the entire land surface of the European Union. The cereals alone, if they were fed directly to people, and this is not a vegetarian news flash, we'll come on to why in a second, but if those cereals alone were fed directly to people, they would feed 3 billion people. So, do we want to feed factories or people? That's the basic surmise. And so the soya meal alone would feed 1 billion people on top of the 3 billion people's worth that of cereals. At a commodity price, I worked out that the cereals and the soya, the corn value and the soya value, is about $280 billion a year being fed to industrial agriculture. Now, the thing about it is that unlike the magician's hat, you don't get something for nothing. In fact, we waste 2/3 of the calorific value, the food value of the cereals, the soya, when it's channeled through livestock, because the livestock eat, live and breathe and do all of the things that living creatures want to do and should be able to do. And what that means is that we actually waste 2.6 billion people's worth of calories by feeding it through industrial livestock. The alternative, of course, is to rear animals much more on a land-based proposition, and therefore avoid losing the commodity price value of that food alone of 186 billion US dollars. If you put it in consumer prices, what people are likely to pay for that food that is wasted, it runs into trillions of US dollars. So really just trying to give a kind of big picture account. Food waste is very much on the agenda, and at the moment there are 3 basic bands of food waste. The first, particularly in developing countries, is food that is wasted before it gets to market, often through want of simple technologies like a grain store. No GM needed, no flashy stuff, just simple technologies. Another portion that is which is now well profiled in the media, is stuff which, particularly in the developed world, we waste in the manufacturing, retail, and consumption section. What I'm trying to show with this slide is that there is the forgotten food waste, which actually is the single biggest portion of food waste, which is that which is fed to industrial livestock. And here we're not counting fish meal, we're just talking about the cereals and soya, and again, just remembering that we squander on a 3-to-1 ratio when we feed through industrial livestock. So that was one of the dependencies. One of the characteristics of the industrial model does appear to be food waste. So this is a very macro level, and so I pulled out some statistics. The latest UN study shows 1/3 of food is wasted. Of course, they're not talking there about the cereals fed to industrial livestock. 28% of agricultural land is wasted in the process. So there is a lot of land that we could save if we didn't waste so much food. The UN put a dollar value on that food waste of $750 billion US dollars, which is equivalent, they said, of the GDP of a country the size of Switzerland. I'm clattering through this and just really wanting to put some big numbers out there to paint what I see as the big picture. And then when we actually break it down, it's not just moldy bread or non-animal products. We are also throwing away the meat equivalent of many millions of animals, which again have a market value that we can put a price on. In Britain, we bin 2.4 billion pounds worth of meat a year. Globally, 12 billion farm animals are reared and slaughtered for nothing, at a wastage value of $486 billion US. We move then on to the other dependency that I mentioned, which is the fact that too many animals in too small a space is a breeding ground for disease, which is often tackled by copious use of prophylactic antibiotics to ward off disease. Growth-promoting antibiotics, of course, apparently being banned in the European Union, but the overall antibiotic use remaining pretty much the same as pre-ban levels. So antibiotic resistance, again, tried to stick to the brief and put some monetary values that we could begin to work with here. Half of all the world's antibiotics go to farm animals. That rises to 80% in the US. That's an awful lot of medicines. The European Commission quite recently actually said that one subset of drug-resistant bacteria alone. Remember that the World Health Organization is talking about, within the next 10 years, if we don't do something, going into a post-antibiotic era globally. The European Commission, one subset of drug-resistant bacteria, causing 25,000 deaths per annum, at a healthcare and lost productivity cost of 1.5 billion euros. Again, putting a dollar value on these negative externalities. And then we go on to the other aspect, which is high levels of saturated animal fats. And we find that research tells us that we can put a figure on the amount of money spent on tackling cardiovascular disease. We know that a recent study backed by the UK government found that in the UK and Brazil, a 30% reduction in meat would yield a 15% reduction in disease, cardiovascular disease. We could then put a dollar value on that, or a sterling value of a saving of 4.35 billion pounds per annum in the UK. That's a lot of saving for the UK health bill. So obesity-related health costs as it stands, unless we do something and start reaping some of these benefits, are looking to escalate. And there's no wonder, because industrial agriculture, so the intensive rearing of animals using grain, so cereal, soya, and fish meal, tends to lend itself to food which is high in saturated fats and lower in other essential nutrients. So no wonder then that through this regime, this quite wasteful regime of bog-off offers of high saturated fat content, apparently cheap meat, we find that obesity-related health costs are expected to rise by 48 billion US dollars in the US, 1.25 billion in the UK. So what do we do about this? So just clattering very quickly. As I see it, some policy measures we could look at advocating would include encouraging land-based farming through policies, subsidies, and tax incentives. Getting back to the land helps the environment, helps the nutritional content of the food, and of course, my heartland helps the animal welfare too. Setting targets, I believe, is really important for the reduction of grain-based animal farming. If we were to reduce it by half, we could feed an awful lot more people. Reducing the overuse of antibiotics seems a preeminently common sense measure that I know has been discussed in this room already today, and provide incentives rather than disincentives for better diets. And I think this is the kind of thing that Jeanette will be coming on to in a moment. Reducing and recycling food waste, which includes the food waste that we can't reduce. Instead of feeding landfill with it, feed it to nature's great recyclers, which of course are pigs and poultry. With that, I thank you very much.
Initially, I was going to try to do some clarifying questions between the presentations, but I just think given the format of the room, we'll just carry on with the presentations, and then we'll bring the presenters up at the end and do all the questions at once. So thank you, Philip. That was very good. We now have Jeanette here to speak to us. Jeanette Longfield is Sustain's coordinator. Many of you will know that Sustain is an alliance of about 100 public organizations working at the international, national, regional, and local level for better food and farming, which is their tagline. Previous to Sustain, Jeanette was the coordinator of the National Food Alliance. She was also a campaigner at the Coronary Prevention Group, a policy analyst at the National Council for Voluntary Organizations. Jeanette spends a lot of her time liaising with policymakers. She contributes to food and farming policy initiatives and appears regularly in the media representing a public interest view on food policy issues. She was awarded I'm assuming MBE as member of the British Empire. She is a member of the British Empire for services to food policy in the 2007 New Year's Honours. And just a little personal footnote, when I was at the Metcalfe Foundation again in Toronto, Jeanette and I collaborated on actually bringing the Sustain model to Canada. And I'm pleased to report that there's a very healthy, vibrant Sustain Ontario that now exists in the province of Ontario. So that's much to do with Jeanette's inspiration. So Jeanette, thank you. And Jeanette will be speaking to us about sugar taxes. So I welcome you.
Hello. Sorry for shouting at you earlier to make you come to the front of the room. And for the people who are sitting at the back, I won't shout at you and make you come to the front, but it's supposed to be a workshop. It'd be quite nice if you're a bit closer. I don't know who this quote is. Never apologise, never explain. But I'm about to do quite a lot of apologising and trying to explain. So I'm not a researcher. I don't have any slides, so I might just wander about a bit to keep you interested. But that means that the people who are sitting at the back, if you can't hear me, come to the front. So I'm feeling a bit, hands in the air, how many people in this room are researchers? Okay, I'm not quite as outnumbered as I thought I was going to be, so that's not too bad. But my other question is, sorry, there's not going to be too much more audience participation, don't panic. How many of the researchers who put their hands up just then, or even how many campaigners in the room, have direct links with each other? So how many researchers have links with campaigners? How many campaigners have links with the researchers? Hands up. Oh, a lot less. More than I was expecting, though. So I'm going to try to persuade you that soon...
This is just for wandering around with.
Oh, thank you.
Good for the camera.
Marvellous. I will try to persuade you that very soon there should be more hands going up where researchers and campaigners work together. So that's my apology. Sorry, not a researcher, no slides. Explanation. The reason why I'm not a researcher and I don't have any slides is that I'm a campaigner. That's my vested interest. Your vested interests are being researchers. And you might be sitting there thinking, excuse me, I think you'll find that's not a vested interest. I'm an objective researcher. I don't think there is any such thing. You might want to shout at me later. I shall move swiftly on. Because on the face of it, we have incompatible vested interests. So as a researcher, all of you will say, quite rightly, it's very complicated, it's very difficult, there's huge gaps in our knowledge, we need more research, can I have a research grant, please? I, as a campaigner, will say, yeah, we've got loads of data, it's fantastic. I'm going to use that data in a campaign. Hello, can I have a campaign grant, please? So on the face of it, we're saying completely opposite things. There's not enough research, we need more research. And I'm going, no, really, there's enough research. Can we just get on with campaigning now, please? So that's not very helpful. Actually, obviously, of course we need more research, of course we need campaigning. The question is, why don't we do more of it? Why do we not talk to each other more? Why do we not link up? I think it's partly to do with different cultures. You know, research has a different culture, research has a different language, campaigners have a different culture and language and way of talking about the world. If you're a researcher, and it's very, very important to be published, and by which you mean peer-reviewed journals. As a campaigner, it's very important to me to be published, by which I mean being on the front page of the Daily Mail. Different thing. So we approach the world in different ways, we have different targets, we have to meet, and all of that, which makes it quite difficult to work together. I also think that money gets in the way. As I said, we all have to get money to live. And we explain to our funders why we need the money, and then that locks us into what we said we would do. It's complicated and difficult, we need more research. It's terribly simple and straightforward, we're going to do campaigning, and the funding keeps us apart, which is unfortunate. So there are reasons why we don't collaborate more, but I think we can get over those. But there is another problem with money, a big problem with money, which sounds like an odd thing to say for a conference that's focusing on true cost accounting for 3 days. Oh, talking far too much about money. But if we, and don't misunderstand me, it's not that I think that true cost accounting and internalising the externalities is a bad idea. I think it's a very, very good idea. However, if we keep going on and on and on to people about money and the cost of things, my worry is that rather reinforces the materialism, which is kind of at the root of the problem. So I'm a little nervous about putting money, pound, dollar, euro values on everything, while at the same time trying to tell people, which I think we should, that actually money isn't really what it's all about. So, note of caution there. Oh, that wasn't me, was it? Okay. There's another reason why I think that, and you're thinking, when's she going to talk about sugar taxes? It's coming. So there's another reason why I think that we shouldn't just talk about money. A speaker earlier on this morning in one of the sessions said, it's a black box about why people do what they do. Not really. What marketing people know really well and can do really well is focus on, put crudely, the 3 A's. Affordability, availability, attractiveness. Now, affordability is clearly very, very important. And we're talking a lot about this over the next few days. Availability, clearly, the stuff has got to be there to buy it. It's one of the things that the big brands do really, really well. They put their product everywhere. But the big A, for me, is attractiveness. What marketing people do fantastically well is make people want the product. It's desirable, it's gorgeous, it makes you popular, it makes you sexy, it makes you... all of the things that marketing people persuade you that their product or service will give you. And that is what sugary drinks companies have done. Their product's not cheap. I mean, it's affordable, for sure. But it's not cheap, considering it's what... I really do hope that's not me. Considering that it's just sugar bubbles and water, it's ridiculous. But it is affordable, and affordable in the markets. Affordable in the markets where they sell it. It's ubiquitously available. We're probably never more than a few hundred yards from a can of Coke or Pepsi or some other fizzy drink. But above all, the marketing budgets of the sugary drinks companies are eye-wateringly huge. So So what are we going to do about that? I think that there's a wave building about doing something about sugary drinks, because they're so patently a stupid and pointless product, even though they've been marketed as being fabulous and gorgeous and contributors to world peace. So I know, you probably all remember I'd like to teach the world to sing, don't you? Oh, dear me. Anyway, which I'm not going to sing. One of the things that Sustain has done is produce this report, and it's called A Children's Future Fund. And you're thinking, no, really, she's bound to get onto sugar tax in a minute. No, this is it. And you will notice that the word tax does not appear anywhere. There's a reason for that. There's a whole genre of research which I'm deeply fascinated by and really not well enough informed about, to do with framing. So George Lakoff, Don't Think of an Elephant, Drew Weston, The Political Brain, Daniel Kahneman's work, and I'm sure there's lots more. And what that tells us, in a very deeply scientific and clever way, is that the way we talk about things is incredibly important. And we've forgotten that. Because we all come from the Enlightenment tradition, because we believe in evidence and we believe that truth will out, we talk about it in those terms. Whereas human beings respond to language, to pictures, to emotions, to values. So that's why there's lots and lots of numbers in here about sugary drinks duties, about taxes, about places where it's worked, about the cost to the health service of diet-related diseases and so on. It's all in here, 300 references, it's enormous. But it doesn't say sugary drinks taxes, and it doesn't because people don't like taxes. Why remind people of something they don't like? So our approach to this issue is to say, okay, here we go. There's a very big problem with children. Children's health, childhood obesity, diet-related diseases. Everybody's really concerned about the world that they're going to grow up in, the environmental catastrophe that awaits, and so on and so on. We must do something about this for our children's future. This is going to cost money. Where are we going to get the money from? Oh, I've got an idea. How about putting a duty on sugary drinks? So that's the way round that we're framing it. We're not saying sugary drinks are horrible, tax them. What we're saying is we need the money for good purposes. A good place to get it would be a duty on sugary drinks. We can ring-fence that money to invest in our children's future. That's a much more enticing proposition than let's tax sugar, at which everybody's going, oh no, don't like the sound of that. Investing in children's future sounds a lot better. And governments all over the world are doing it. Mexico is the latest to go down that road. There are several other countries doing it, all listed in here. There are lots of other examples of duties, and I use the term duty, not tax, because it has a very nice double meaning. Duty because it's a form of tax, and duty because there is a duty to children. There are other examples of ring fencing that I can talk about. I won't because I'm going on too long. So I know that treasuries and financial institutions around the world, government institutions, do not like ring fencing, but they will do it if pushed. And I very much hope that we are going together to push them. But I think that we'll have a much better chance of success of doing that if the campaigners and the researchers gang up a bit so that we can put some pressure on the policymakers to do what they really should do, but really don't want to. That's it.
Turn this off. Or is it off? I'll leave it. Thank you, Jeanette. It was reminding me of a meeting I went to once where it was in a very low-income community in Toronto, and it was a bunch of foundations and a bunch of scientists and then a bunch of residents. And the foundation folks started with an introduction about the whole issue, and one of the low-income residents put up his hand and he said, "You people don't really talk like this, do you?" Anyway, to your point about framing and the way we slip very easily into jargon that becomes inaccessible. Anyway, thank you. Next, we have Matt Reed. Matt is a senior research fellow with the Countryside and Community Research Institute. He's been with the Institute since 2007 and is a subject group leader for the Economy and Society Research Cluster. He's also with the University of Gloucester. For more than a decade, Matt has been researching the organic food movement from various perspectives. And alongside this interest, he has research interest in the family farm, in rural communities, social networks, fishing communities, and the changing technologies of food. As a sociologist, he's interested in how and why social change takes place around food, and he'll be talking to us about the social dimension of different farming systems with some thoughts from home and perhaps even some from abroad.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, so I'd like to start off by saying that I'm going to take you through a very quick trot through a lot of research that I've conducted with a lot of colleagues. They're not here, I am, but full credit to them, and I'll show you how to sort of follow up on the team activity that is. I wanted to start with the next slide. There we go. This very familiar thing, the farm family business, an incredibly stable social institution that if we just break it down and start to think about its complexity, becomes quite interesting in its sophistication, but also as a resource that we can use for change, but also a signal of what changes are happening. It's very interesting that actually our introduction was given by a family farmer. The voice, the words of Prince Charles, of course, he's a family farmer. He inherited his farms. He looks to his children to succeed to them. And family farming is an immensely diverse and differentiated activity, ranging from the British royal family through to people who have a small patch of land and who are struggling to keep body and soul together. But as a basic social idea, it's a really strong one. Take a piece of land, take a family, join their futures together. The farm itself, we can see in various ways. Lots of people will talk about from ecology and environmentalism about the farm, but from a social perspective, it's a cultural artifact, that it's something that people have crafted and worked at. It's a chance to be part of a biotic community. People value enormously sharing their lives with plants and animals. And also, of course, there is that food production activity that is a very interesting and important aspect of it, but not the only one. The second thing is the family part. People often talk about the future. In family farms, you see very actively the future and the past brought together. People are farming because their parents farmed that land. They are, again, looking forward. So often in family farms, you find the discussions, the timescales slip back and forward, making it quite a sophisticated and quite a tricky thing to understand what's happening. Also, it's a profound sense of identity. Many people, their identity, many of our national identities are tied up with our relationship with the land, and that is manifested through farmers. You know, the salt of the earth farmer. Many of our democracies are premised upon the idea that farms produce great citizens. A lot of the empirical work suggests that they do produce great citizens, but that identity question is really important. And then we turn to the business. First of all, employing the family. And the family can be employed in all sorts of ways. We shouldn't be blind to this idea. I often say to people, I've rarely spoken to a farmer. When people come and say, have you spoken to a farmer? I've usually spoken to a member of the family who is speaking as if they are the farmer. It's a collective enterprise. And we shouldn't sort of negate and hide the role that particularly women play in farming that's often hidden by this, using this term, the farmer. It's also an asset. This asset protects people from poverty, protects people from hunger, and it gives you social status. And that's why people are reluctant to give it up, and also spot people who become wealthy. What do? Buy a farm. How many rock stars have you seen interviewed around the farm table? Because that's what you do. You invest in that asset. However, when I show you some of this empirical work, we can see that the food chain shapes and reshapes the farm business. And that's really important to understanding what's happening in agriculture, and also what I describe as the moral link. People wanted to be in farming and want to be in farming very often because of the autonomy that it gives them, the ability to make choices. And very often those choices are circumscribed now by the farming food chain. Okay, this is a very complicated graph in many ways, but also a simple shape, hopefully. A few years ago, British government invested in us trying to understand the social footprints of different farming systems. What do different farming systems bring to the wider community? So we went off, we tried to find ways of measuring many of those very abstract, amorphous things that I've just described and putting numbers to them. Not pound values or dollar values, but just some numbers to them. This is when you're struck by traffic traveling in either direction. Anthropologists leap out and say, how dare you put figures on that? Equally, the economists were saying, we did this years ago. So you're struck by traffic in either direction. But what this graph shows is we've compressed 40-odd questions and a lot of work into 11 axes that try and describe the social life of different parts of farms. If you just look at the green line are organic farms, the blue line are non-organic farms, and the red line is the average. So, I'd love to entertain you for several hours about how we got to this, but just look at the lines and it all becomes quite apparent. The green line, the organic farms, make a bigger contribution to rural development because of the way that they trade. The food chains that they're involved in, veg box, direct sales schemes, retains more value in the rural economy. They employ not just more people, but a more diverse group of people, and that has an impact on the rural economy. However, if you just notice, the green line nudges in a little bit, and that's because organic farmers tend to be incomers. They tend to be people who've moved into farming or moved between areas. If you look at the blue line, you can see that many of the non-organic farmers are people who've been involved in farming for generations, and so they've got a very low physical mobility. Now, you may see that as being very boring and staid. Equally, those are the core people who anchor a rural society. They stayed there, they're fighting on, they're living there for generations, they're creating that rural community. So there's pros and cons, ups and downs. The other little thing that you can see about that is the food chain shapes the farm business, not policy. And that's very interesting to see the food chain and the corporate role in configuring a farm business. Now this was complex, expensive, quite difficult to do unless you're a trained team of sociologists who have a couple of years just to spare. So more recently, we've been involved with a team trying to put together a triple bottom line, trying to integrate the economic, the environmental, and the social into one set of metrics, which leads you to very exciting discussions, such as the carbon footprint people saying, we do it by the kilogram. And I said, well, I can only work in whole units of people. A person is what counts for me. So we've had long, exciting discussions about that. But what we've been able to do is start to turn these social metrics into 7 key questions. 7 questions that we can ask and differentiate the social footprints of farms. So we're actually turning it into a viable tool. There's a little graph there that clearly shows that there are differences between organic, non-organic, and the average farm. Daniel's going to pick up on that in the next presentation, so I'm not going to linger. But we are moving towards a tool that can be used. Much of this work is peer-reviewed and will be certain soon, so it will be robust. However, we're also conscious that where farms are changing. The transition to urban areas is actually making a change in what farms are. And so we're starting to see a disruption of the farm family business model as people are starting to farm in urban areas. And that means that the social aims of farms are different. It's not just about securing a family, it's about securing a wider group. And who are this group? What are their aims at? It's often about shorter term, because at the moment these are experiments, these are people coming together trying to achieve social group aims, but we haven't got that history yet. There's different food chains, they're trying to sell within the city, trying to sell more locally, and also the status games are different and the moral links are different. So far, we haven't been able to apply these metrics to these urban farms, but what we can observe is that they are producing profound social effects, very important areas of social cohesion, community togetherness. The only problem is they're not producing an awful lot of food. And so what we see is a slight divergence in that we have a very productive rural, a less productive urban, but the urban is producing some profound social benefits. So, as I say, this is a race through a lot of research, but what we come to about the social externalities of the farm business is it's more than just jobs, and we can apprehend, we can get a handle upon what this is more than employment. I'm not dismissing employment as being important, but for many years we've known what employment is off the back of farming. Now that we can actually have a more sophisticated, a more nuanced discussion, then we can actually start to build an evidence base that is beyond just jobs. There are distinct differences by farm type. You know, we've demonstrated this, other studies have demonstrated this, so therefore it does, as Jeanette suggests, become a matter of policy, a matter of actually why do we not have farming systems that employ more people, have greater rural development results. Now, I'm not necessarily a policy person, but that becomes an acute question of why that is there. The other thing then becomes the importance of retail and distribution. You know, Jessica talked earlier about flipping the food chain, and in effect that's what has happened. The supermarkets, the retail chains configure the farm businesses. It may not be that Ruth's grandparents particularly wanted to run a farm in the shape that they wanted to, but if they were going to maintain themselves in that farm, those were the choices. You either get big or you get out, you get intensive or you get out, or a small group of people find another route. And it's about making those routes more available to farmers. And so the question comes, what sorts of farms do we want? And actually, if you pose that question to consumers, if you ask people, what do they imagine a farm to be? Do you think you come up with what farms actually look like? And I always think that's a really interesting area of traction. If you ask people not price questions, not questions that are very related to rationality, but actually start to talk to people about what sort of farm would you like to see, you get some very different answers. Okay, thank you very much. I'm aware that's a hugely quick trot. That's how you can find out more about the research and give my co-authors and colleagues their just praise. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Matt. And we'll have time to build on the quick trot once we get into questions. Okay, finally we have Daniel Fujiwara, who is with us from the London School of Economics. He's a member of the Centre for Economic Performance. He's also a consultant specializing in policy evaluation and social impact measurement. He's got several advisory roles, including Chief Scientific Advisor to the SROI Network and a lecturer on policy evaluation to the Government Economic Services. His research specializes in microeconomic theory, econometrics, non-market valuation, and behavioral science. Previously, Daniel had many different posts with various ministries of the UK government. I won't go through all of them. As well, he has held research positions with the United Nations. He's the John Hoy Memorial Prize winner in economics for his contribution to policy evaluation methodology with the UK government. And he's also advised many high-profile organizations. He's now here to advise this high-profile group of people. And he'll be talking to us about valuing social externalities, looking at the lens of monetization and potential policy mechanisms. Thank you, and welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so just as a bit of a disclaimer, I've done barely no research at all in kind of food, farming, that area. My research has all been in policy evaluation, looking at kind of cause and effect relationships and also valuing those outcomes, especially on the area of kind of non-market goods or externalities. And I've got a bunch of slides. A bit of it's about kind of the theory around valuation. So I want to talk in a bit more depth around what value means when we try to put a pound sign on something. And then also give you some examples of a quick bit of work that I did actually for the purpose of this presentation. So to kick off, if we think of valuation as a process whereby we convert some kind of hard outcome, let's say on improved life years or higher degree attainment at university or something, onto another metric which holds some kind of value to us, okay? So if we think about valuation in that way, it doesn't necessarily have to be in monetary terms, okay? We could put it onto a scale of 0 to 1. We could compare, we could compare the gains in one area, let's say in environmental policy, and we could measure that in terms of gains in life years, gains somewhere else in health, okay? So we could measure something in health gains. When we look at specifically monetary valuation methods, they're what is known as welfareist. So they put human welfare at the very center of everything. So that's what we're trying to measure when we attach a monetary value to something in economics, okay? So you might be familiar with this term, intrinsic and instrumental. We stick welfare, human welfare, as the ultimate intrinsic good. So everything matters, okay? So better health, better farms, better food systems, better education, all of that matters, but it matters insofar as it matters for human welfare at the end of the day, okay? And there's actually quite an interesting question that economists don't get into, but philosophers like to think about, is who this welfare is applicable to, okay? So in economics, it's anthropocentric, which means that it's human welfare that we're interested in measuring. But we could think about inclusive welfarism, which is the welfare of humans and all other living creatures, okay? Economics can't deal with inclusive welfarism in cost-benefit analysis and valuation. So unfortunately, at the moment, it's rendered only based on human welfare. But that doesn't mean to say, for example, the existence of a species of whale or a rainforest doesn't matter. They still matter insofar as they show up in terms of impacts on our welfare, okay? So in terms of the theory, how do we get from this kind of idea of impacts on welfare to a monetary value? Well, what we do is we try and look for an equivalent amount of money that would create the same amount of welfare as the non-market good we're interested in, okay? So if we're trying to value a reduction in local area crime, and we find that improves people's welfare on some measure by, let's say, 10%, we're looking at the equivalent amount of money that would also create or induce that 10% increase in someone's welfare, okay? And in this sense, you can now see that valuation doesn't have to be monetary, because we could look at the compensating mechanism in terms of new Rolls Royces, okay? How many Rolls Royces do we have to give to people? How many chocolate bars do we have to give to people to compensate them, okay? It's normally done in money because the costs of an intervention are already in financial terms, so it makes it easier to compare against, okay? And so where all this goes is into cost-benefit analysis, or social return on investment, you might be aware of. So this is basically looking at the cost of that intervention or some activity against the benefits, and because we've monetized those benefits, they're on the kind of same metric and they can be comparable. Okay, so the really important point that often gets missed about CBA is that it's about welfare. It's not just around public health savings, hospital savings. So it's a lot broader than that. It's the welfare of all individuals in society, okay? And this is, I think, where we can now start to tap into kind of, food, farming and stuff like that. We're thinking about quality of life when we want to put a monetary value on something. And this has to include non-market goods. It's not just the market goods. Okay, so the really, I think, the key question here when we start to think about monetary valuation is what form of welfare or human welfare, well-being, holds moral weight? So how do we measure someone's well-being, okay? So over the past couple of hours, a lot of people have said, for example, is this the type of farming system that we want? Is that the farming system that satisfies people's preferences? Okay, so preferences, or the satisfaction of preferences, is one way of measuring whether people are getting what they want and hence their quality of life is better. Okay, and that's the standard measure that economists would use to try and attach values to something. And through preferences, we could, for example, attach monetary values to different types of products, whether they've been farmed organically or not, whether they've used certain types of pesticides and things like that, okay, or whether they've come from fair trading. And here the important point is it's not just the price that we're interested in. So if I go to the market and buy myself a Big Mac, okay, for £1, I might be absolutely starving and I would value that Big Mac at £20 at that point in time, okay? I'm just lucky that it's available in the market for £1. It doesn't mean that I value the Big Mac at £1 at that point, okay? So we want to do something a bit more sophisticated with people's preferences, which is not just the price that we see floating around in markets, it's the maximum willingness to pay that people have, okay? Or for a bad outcome, the minimum willingness to accept, which looks a bit like compensation, okay? And there are studies, and I think Ian Bateman, who's currently talking in another workshop, he's done a fair bit on different kind of food products and the maximum willingness to pay for that, okay? So what if we were to move away now from people's preferences and put the moral weight on how people feel about their lives, okay? And how people report feeling about their lives, right? So this goes on a tangent. We're still thinking about human welfare ultimately, but instead of looking at whether we give people what they want, we're now looking at whether the experience of their lives are good, reported by themselves or not, okay? So this touches on the idea of subjective well-being, so the subjective being self-reported well-being. And there's a massive policy agenda here, also in the US and France, on bringing measures of people's self-reported well-being into the policy analysis, okay? And there's quite a big spectrum of them, so you could get anything from life satisfaction to happiness in the moment, anxiety in the moment, to whether you think the things that you do in life are worthwhile, etc. And you can take these metrics as single one-off metrics, so you could just look at life satisfaction on its own, or you can mix them, match them, and weight them differently. So you could have a scale that kind of merges all of these happiness, anxiety, life satisfaction metrics together. Okay. So this is the only little bit of kind of complex stuff here. But if you take that picture on the right, okay, so we have a policy outcome, okay, and here we could have some kind of farming-related intervention. And we're interested, those arrows are the kind of kickback or the knock-on effect on people's subjective well-being. So we're interested in the effect of a policy outcome on someone's well-being, and also the effect of money if we want to go and value that outcome, okay? And so that we can do all this with currently available data or collect the data and find, just like I did in that crime example, that lower levels of crime increase people's life satisfaction, and let's say £10,000 of extra income would also increase their life satisfaction the same rate. We can back out the value of lower levels of crime, okay? And this would kind of reflect what we would get if we asked people their willingness to pay for lower levels of life crime, okay, in theory. In reality, it doesn't. And here, this kind of technique it's very recent, and it's the method that I focus on, but there's a lot of kind of benefits or advantages there if we're thinking about community beneficial impacts from farming, the employment-related impact, whether there are any kind of charitable, voluntary-related impacts, civic-related impacts of farming. We can also, I've restricted it here to community employment, but we could also think about environmental impacts. So we can look at CO2 emissions and the way that impacts on people's subjective well-being and get a value of that or a cost of that as well, okay? So most economists would ask people's willingness to accept for some increase in level of CO2 emissions. We could also look at how that affects people's self-reported well-being and get a cost out of it that way, okay? But in both methods, we've moved away from prices or just actual market costs, and we're starting to think about the quality of a person's life, whether that's the preferences that they satisfy or the experience of their lives, okay? And there's a huge amount of literature on the relative benefits or advantages and disadvantages of these two methods, and I can get onto that during the conversation. But you know, for example, one example is in health. If we take the standard health impact assessments that Marion was talking about earlier, that's all based on a preference satisfaction account of the world, okay? So if we ask people, if we try and attach a monetary value to a health outcome or quality adjusted life year value to a health outcome, we're going to be asking people about their preferences between different health states of the world. Okay? We can also now do that through subjective well-being, not asking them anything about whether they would prefer to be with dementia than paraplegia or something like that. We can just look at how dementia and paraplegia impact on their life experiences. And in the experience, mental health is a lot more important than physical health. Okay? So there are big, big policy issues here. For example, the Department of Health that uses that preference satisfaction account would put a lot more money into physical health than it should be doing if we looked at people's experiences in life. Okay? And I'm sure if we start to explore this in the farming and agricultural context, we will see that often what people want might not be what's best for them in the experiences of their lives. And the fizzy drinks example is a good one. So, you know, the three A's, you know, the attractiveness and affordability, that all kind of sums up to people, a certain type of person wanting those fizzy drinks, right? In the experience of their lives 40 years later, they shouldn't have done that. And that's where the second form of data can help us shed a bit more light onto things. And just to finish with, if we focus on the subjective well-being account of well-being, and think, and I did a little bit of kind of back of the envelope stuff on farming. So we looked at how working on a farm, smallholder farm, impacts on people's happiness and life satisfaction, okay? And it was positive and pretty large, and this was using the largest data set we have in the UK, the British Household Panel Survey, that goes on for about the last 20 years. And we can attach a value to that. So the value of an average job in the UK is about £10,000 in addition to the wage, okay? So this is the quality of life adjustment for employment. So employment is worth a lot more to people than just their wages. It reduces anxiety, reduces stigma, reduces depression, etc. Farming, in addition to that 10,000, okay, has an extra kick of about £2,500, okay, maybe around the stigma. I think what a lot of it is that it's coming through health. So I'm finding quite a big correlation between mental and physical health and farming, okay, and because health is good for your overall well-being, it lifts that up. Also, if this is very general again, employment training, if farms become kind of the foundation for younger people to go out and get work experience and valuable life skills, in addition to any income benefit that they get in future life, that is worth about £800 to them a year, okay, just from the impact that it has on their well-being. Again, if we go back to kind of smallholder family networks, okay, having a strong family basis, okay, and this is not just relevant to farming, but, you know, in general, is worth about £6,800 in addition to anything else that you could think of, okay? So, and if smallholder community farms induce this kind of impact, that's a further benefit. And then finally, kind of more widely in the community, if farms are able to bring communities together or increase their cohesion, again, that could be worth in the order of about £4,000 per individual in society in terms of improvements in their quality of life. Okay, and that's it. So thank you very much for having me.
So if I can ask all the speakers to come up to the front, and we'll dive into questions and discussion. I don't know if this is the only mic. Is that the only mic? So we'll keep the mic up here, just for, great. There we go. Okay, so thank you all. Those were very interesting presentations, and I think it's a really interesting panel in the sense that we've got some folks deeply, deeply bedded in food and farming issues. We've got others that, you know, not so much. Daniel said that he hasn't worked in this area much at all. We've got some folks very much on the research side, some more embedded in policy. Jeanette, who's more on the campaign side. So anyway, it's quite an interesting mix of perspectives and experience. So anyway, I encourage questions from the floor. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in with the first question. Yes, go ahead, Christy.
I'm interested on your economic analysis. And I don't really quite help me phrase the question. I'm interested in the value that the person would put on their lives, on each day of their lives. I mean, we have enough facts, I think, to know that this is a serious health issue that we're dealing with here, increases and all these diseases. And so would you or have you put into the well-being analysis, you know, okay, Christy, how much value do you put on a potential each additional day of your life? And if we're at war, how do you use that well-being thing? Because if we're at war, it seems to me we're talking about life or death. And so the well-being analysis, to me, ought to be based on the fact that we're at war. And does that make any sense to you as an economist?
Yeah, so the kind of data that we have would be very difficult to put a value on each extra day or hour that someone's alive. We're looking more at, we need to single out an impact of something on someone's well-being, and we can't do that for the day, but we could do that for obesity or a digestive system disorder or something like that. So we're looking at events or activities or circumstances, how that impacts on someone's life, rather than a duration or time aspect. So but we could think about if, if fatty foods lead to severe obesity at the age of 40, for the rest of your life, let's say for 30 odd years, we could attach a cost to the obesity, and we could multiply that by the number of years left, but we couldn't do it for the average person's. We couldn't get you an extra value for just 1 year of life randomly assigned to someone in society. You have to make it specific. You have to say that person lives with obesity or some other health condition, and then we can back out the values.
Do any of the other panelists have any comments on that in terms of valuation and where you've seen that it's been really useful or where you felt you've hit hurdles?
Can I just add one?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the other thing that, so the other important thing around health, so that's a quality of life impact, right? So I can give you one, depression and anxiety is about minus £45,000 a year if you use this approach, okay, in addition to the potentiality of you losing your job and stuff like that. Just the emotional cost of depression is about minus 45,000. That would be in addition to any of the NHS or medical care expenses, therapy, etc., drugs associated with trying to cure that disease. Okay, so these are values around quality of life which are different to just exchequer-related benefits. Okay, so, and they're important in themselves because they can often outweigh just what the government gets back or what happens to the government in terms of changes in medical expenses.
Thank you. Yeah.
Tara Garnett at University of Oxford. I've got a question mainly for Daniel, but also for Jeanette. So you've got your preference analysis, whatever it's called, and you've got subjective well-being analysis. My question is there a kind of tipping point of basic income level above which the subjective well-being analysis carries more weight with people? I mean, I'm thinking about very low-income developing countries where, and going back to your Coke example, where you want that thing and you want it now, and in fact you need it now, and to look at the longer term, retrospectively, how might I feel, or how might it go beyond my material needs, that may carry less weight. And I suppose when we're talking about true cost accounting, my feeling is that it will inevitably lead to more expensive food, which is necessary, and you may get cheaper costs of healthcare, et cetera, elsewhere. But that comes back to how we as individuals make decisions and see one thing as being comparable with something else. So more expensive food, if you have the long-term view, you can say, oh yes, but it will save me on my healthcare costs. But if you're trying to survive, that just doesn't carry any weight at all. So it goes to the comment to Jeanette that links in with that is that, yes, there is something perhaps inherently problematic with the idea of assigning an economic value to the environment or whatever it might be. But in low-income countries where people, if they are going to be undertaking systems of agriculture that are in the long term sustainable, then they need to be compensated in monetary terms, because that really is what matters for many people.
Jeanette?
To tackle the issue of poverty and food prices, I know this is a really trite thing to say, but the problem there is poverty, not food prices. So I am very much in favour of a living wage and benefits that people can live on so that they're not poor anymore. I don't think we get anywhere by keeping prices artificially low, which has all sorts of hideous damaging effects, as well as, in fact, encouraging people in the food chain to remain poor in the catering industry and the farming industry, which are dismally badly paid jobs. So we need to get out of that vicious downward spiral. And you would be right to say, it's all very well for you to say people shouldn't be poor. They are, yes, but that doesn't mean I should also campaign for food staying cheap. So I want to campaign for both those things. I think that's probably enough.
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but so the two ways you might want to look at, for example, fatty foods, fizzy drinks, in a preference or a well-being account of the world, one would be you could look at consumers' preferences. This is a preference account, and you can see them purchasing these bad drinks at the age of 20, 21, something like that. And then we don't see much of their activities after that. That preference is made at one point in time, and we are reliant on them having full information about that, the side effects of that fizzy drink for the rest of their life when they make that decision, which they hardly ever do. Even with full information, it's impossible for them to do that. If we think about people's experiences and their self-reported well-being, we'd be looking at how their well-being impacts over time. So if they drink a lot of fizzy drinks, it will show up when they're about 45 that they're obese or overweight. So it gives you a longer lens to look over. So there's a big distinction between whether you analyse the worthiness of the policy based on someone's preference satisfied at one point in time, where we're assuming them to have full information, or we don't assume any information rationality for that individual and just let them live their lives and track their experiences, you get very different policy outcomes and implications.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add that I think we need to be wary of individualising the discussion a little bit too much, and partly that came up in the discussion of the medical framework earlier. It would appear that obesity is kind of socially contagious, that if you know people who are obese, your chances of becoming obese rise. Similarly, with unhappiness, if you know people who are unhappy, that has a societal effect. And there's a lot of work to show that very unequal societies, even those people at the top of the income distribution tree, are actually affected by the inequalities at the bottom. So if we individualize too much, we kind of lose what are, in effect, network effects. And so, I may not be losing, but other people are, and in turn that will affect my life. And I think that's one of the things we just need to be careful with when we individualize.
Great.
Just one more thing on obesity. So another really fascinating area where this experience wellbeing data can help is that there's been some studies on obesity, and they've looked at people who become obese and then stay obese and how their well-being and experiences fluctuate over their lives. And what we find is that obesity at the start, the onset, is pretty bad for you, and health conditions related to obesity are bad for you, but people tend to adapt to obesity. So they play less sport and they enjoy watching daytime TV, or they enjoy the internet instead of going out for a run. So actually, over time, there's a bit of a disincentive effect within obesity itself. Okay, so if people are adapting to obesity, whatever you throw at them, they don't think it's an issue in their lives anymore. Okay, and we're starting to see that in the UK, in a lot of the data, that people who've had onset of obesity a long time ago are less likely to make important decisions to change their lifestyle now, because they adapt to it. So there's an important question around adaptation to health impacts, which the wellbeing analysis can bring out as well.
Great. This is a good question. Everybody wants to get in on it. So Philip, go ahead.
Just wanted to add a point, picking up on the remark that obesity can be contagious, and that is also between species. and just to make the point that if one eats obese animals, fast-growing chickens, fast-growing pigs with high levels of saturated fat and low protein, then of course that has consequent health consequence. And it's worth recognizing that the healthy meat, the standard intensive chicken that was launched into the market probably somewhere around the 1970s, is now calculated to be nearly 3 times higher in fat, 30% lower in protein, higher in fat than protein than it was in those days. And if you buy the organic chicken these days, then you'll find that they are in the order of 25% lower in fat. So obesity really is contagious across species as within communities.
Interesting. Cool. Yes, I've got a question there. I've got a bunch. Okay, I'm tracking these. Okay, go ahead.
Hannah Lorison, I was really intrigued by your comments, Jeanette, about the tension between campaigners and researchers. And you alluded to research priorities that you think are critical to advancing the policy dialogue. So I'd be very curious to hear you expand on that further, and also to hear from the other panelists, what areas of research do you think are needed to advance the dial? You know, a few hours into this meeting, and I'm thoroughly depressed. So I'm hoping that perhaps we can look for some opportunities for policy change on all of these critical issues.
Thank you. Who wants to?
If I had a big bag of cash, I would spend it on doing some framing research. I'm groping towards doing it better than I used to, and my colleagues likewise. So for example, about 20 years ago, we started a campaign to ban junk food advertising. And that was what we wanted. In fact, it's still what we want. But I never say that now. I always talk about protecting children from junk food marketing. And there is a world of difference in the attractiveness of that message. Banning things, illiberal, not very nice, don't want to be associated with it. Protecting children, how could you possibly be against it? But I'm winging it, basically. I'm making this up as I go along. I'm reading some books and doing my best. I'd like to have some proper money to get that much better. The kind of money that marketing people have got to get their messages right.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else, if you had a big bag of cash, what you would do with it?
Well, I just wanted to support Jeanette really in terms of that tension. There really is a tension between wanting more research and data and the need to get messages out. And the classic for us, of course, was with hens being kept in battery cages. You know, it was, as our founder, who was a farmer, used to say about veal crates. When he lost a controversial controversial court case in the 1980s, a damn fool can see that it's cruel. You know, sometimes it's not data that's needed, it's not evidence that's needed, it's just getting out there and making it a public issue. That said, of course, being able to drill into some of these topics and translate our issue into the language, and again comes back to framing, into the language of others, and that for many senior politicians, public authorities, and businesses, of course, you talk about the language of economics, financial economics in particular. So trying to show the world as it could be and as it should be in their language, in their financial language, I think is quite an important thing. And I was intrigued, actually, that some of the numbers that I put in the presentation today, and I was really just throwing out ideas. Some of those numbers we put together for this presentation. And I would like to do a piece which says, given the fact that there are eye-poppingly big dollar values against the bad stuff, how can we rearrange the financial frame to deliver what we really want?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Matt, go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to say, a few years ago I worked with some sociolinguists about the marketing language around organic food. And in distinction maybe to what Jeanette's saying, but hopefully in dialogue with it, they became more distrustful of organic food the more it used the language of marketing. That actually the language of marketing, and I would suggest the language of a lot of our public debate, has become debased by marketing language and its techniques and PR, and actually what people responded to very well when they were buying organic produce, and I would hazard a guess that in many other areas as well, is actually language that isn't based upon marketing and its dominance. But I'm a researcher, not a campaigner, so maybe I've got the luxury of saying that. And also, I would say, just as an aside, don't be depressed. Because if you
it's
look
expensive, I've just learned.
But if yeah, exactly. One, it's expensive and bad for you.
That's right.
But also, two, over this discussion, what we've seen is historically, rapidly, very fast change to this situation. And so, we should not presume that we could not have rapid change away from this situation. As people have pointed out, the current system is sticky, it's resilient, it's tough, all of those sorts of things. But, if we look at the span of this, change is possible, change happens all of the time. So, we should probably try and be optimistic at the very least.
So I've got 7 folks lined up. The first one is the woman in the green sweater. Sorry, I don't know your name. Yep.
I'm Nadia Shalaba from FAO.
Great.
I was very interested by your presentation on quality of life, and I was wondering whether you have, beyond the networking and what did you have, belonging, mental health, and other things, whether you have a methodology to link environmental degradation, which is caused by unsustainable systems, on the quality of life of people. I mean, I'm thinking about women who have to walk much more to fetch water, for example, and all these kind of harsh conditions that do affect quality of life of people.
Yeah, so that method is only constrained by the level of data that you have. So those figures were based on survey data that we have for the UK. We have, for example, the World Values Survey that covers quite a lot of Africa. We've got the Latin American version of that. So there's a good amount of data out there that would allow you to do this. And where there isn't data, you could always collect the data yourself. So if you're thinking very, very specifically around, for example, distance to walk to a well, or child labour issues on a farm or something like that, you may need to collect your own data. And we've done that in the past. So we did a project with Kraft Foods in Ghana, looking at eradication of child poverty there, and the impact that has on the quality of life of the children and the families. So, and just in terms of secondary data, we could do a lot more. That was just kind of a bite-sized example. But there's a lot of data on environment and stuff, and there's always primary data collection that you can do to expand it.
Great. Teresa, I think you're next.
Yes, Teresa Fey Bustillos, and this is primarily for Daniel, but also for any of the speakers. Daniel, you spoke a lot about the use of the subjective well-being analysis done for the public sector, and you mentioned a minute ago the Kraft study, and that's really the basis of my question. How is this being used, subjective well-being, by farms or the food production sector or by the private sector in general? And if it is being used, how do we get to a place where we could start to compare data across the food producers or across farms? Because it's one thing to have subjective well-being for a single farm or a single producer, but that doesn't really tell the consumer much unless you can actually compare, food producers or compare farms. So how close are we to getting to that stage?
So in terms of private companies, there's a big growing interest. So another group that I work with is the Danone Group in Bonafont in Mexico, where they used to measure whether their waste pickers are getting what they want in life, i.e. their preferences are being satisfied, but we've moved now to a quality of life measure. And lots of companies in the UK as well, for example, transport industry, whether the creation or loss of a rail network in, let's say, the northeast of England, in addition to any kind of exchequer-related costs and benefits, how does that impact the quality of life, especially of elderly people in that area? And most of this is going down the line of, because that data may not necessarily be available in large national data sets, the company themselves are incorporating the primary data collection costs. So there's growing data, but it's a bit disparate. So you'll get stuff on transport links, you might get stuff on fatty foods or the building of a football stadium, which are not completely comparable. So there's a push there, if going back to that question of if you had a lot more cash, I'd like to do a lot more primary research on quality of life and different indicators. And the other issue is when you work with private companies, they tend not to want to release the data. especially if some of the findings aren't that great. So, you know, in terms of campaigning, if Danone or Kraft Foods or whatever have got great data on quality of life and agriculture in Africa, we need to push them to release that under some, you know, Freedom of Information Act or something like that.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, hello, my name's Abby Bunker. I'm Head of Agriculture Policy at the RSPB, the Royal Society of Protection of Birds. It's a fascinating set of presentations and discussion, which I'm trying in my head and on my very messy notepad to try and draw together and think of some interesting themes. But Jeanette, what you said really struck me about your caution about valuation and tapping into values which are perhaps the opposite values that we actually want to bring alive and tap into. And there's been some really fascinating work done by the Public Interest Research Centre up in Wales, and they've just published a fascinating kind of review of the literature called Common Cause for Nature, which does challenge the civil society working in environment and social, the areas we're talking about how we talk and frame things which tap into the intrinsic values that are really going to be important in people, and that's across the board from farmers to policymakers to the public, and what language we use. So I was kind of interested in the group's view on that, whether going too far, where's the line in the kind of valuing and monetizing things, where we perhaps start to tap into the wrong values and we activate the wrong values. And just a kind of a supplementary comment, because I'm sitting here, this often, generally I spend a lot of my time with audiences with a lot of farmers, and I have noticed at least one farmer over there that I recognise, but I'm sure there are more farmers here that I don't know. Just building on the point about framing and language and authenticity, which Matt, I think you talked about, and the language being authentic, I think that's really critical, that we really need to remember that when we're talking about what farming do we want, there's the whole community of farmers who have, who are the guys who will decide ultimately and who need to be influenced and persuaded or and listened to. And in our limited experience at RSPB over the last 15 years of working with farmers, and we've learnt a lot, and we're still learning, is that pushing people into corners and telling them that what they're doing is bad doesn't generally work very well, and that it's actually a whole different kind of conversation which you need to have to change, and we're still learning that and I hope getting better at it.
Good, thank you.
Sorry, that was a bit long.
Yeah, that's okay. So any thoughts on...
Yeah, something on the limits of the valuation stuff. So governments tend to like you measuring the benefits and then attaching a value to them so they can compare them back to their costs. But all of this, could be left in some kind of quality of life metric, right? So you could just say certain types of farming lead to more obesity, and that is bad for your health and that's bad for your well-being, and leave it at that. So, and a lot of people just do that kind of research. And the other thing is, my main worry is that if we ask people about their market preferences for different things, right, and especially when we try to bring in an externality or non-market good, for example, saving birds, there's an example study of this, and we ask them their willingness to pay to save a species of bird or something, it changes the whole meaning of the bird species for that person, okay, in a bad way. So when we ask people to put willingness to pay values on non-market goods, it can change the experience that they have from those non-market goods. So that's one of my tensions with the preference account and asking people willingness to pay all the time. I would prefer to ask people about the quality of their life and not having them think about, oh, how much would I pay for that? And we can measure that through the statistical analysis in the background.
Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I feel conflicted in answering it because my natural inclination is to go with the intrinsic value. As a passionate wildlife enthusiast, as an animal protectionist that believes in the intrinsic value of animals as well as communities and etc. I come from a point of intrinsic value. I bump up against the reality that policymakers do want to put dollar signs in front of things, and that's the language that they speak. I've come to that language very late. I did quite enjoy putting together the presentation today. I did find that the statistics gave us very strong, powerful levers, particularly in this equation of how we're going to feed 9 billion people. Well, just stop wasting 5 or 6 billion people's worth of food. That's how you do it. So I think by putting things into some numbers, we actually help the intrinsic value causes that we are starting from.
Mm-hmm.